He threw the contract across the table before she even sat down. The paper hit the edge and slid off onto the floor, and Colton Reeves didn't look at it. He looked at her, at Evelyn Hartwell, like she was something the wind had blown in and he hadn't yet decided whether to sweep out. "Sign it or don't," he said. "Either way, you're here because your father ran out of options, not because anyone wanted you." Evelyn picked up the contract from the floor, slowly, without breaking his gaze. That moment, that particular silence between them, with the Montana wind pressing against the windows and his mother watching from the doorway like a judge at a hanging, was the moment Evelyn understood exactly what kind of war she had walked into. And she had walked in with nothing but her name and a mind they hadn't thought to be afraid of yet. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you fought hard to reach, stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Hit like and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Hartwell Ranch had never been beautiful, not in the way that made people stop their wagons and stare. It was functional land, carved up by creek beds, beaten by wind, sitting on the eastern edge of a valley that didn't get enough rain and got too much winter. Evelyn had grown up on that land the way children grow up inside a struggling thing. You learn its rhythms not because anyone teaches you, but because survival makes a teacher of necessity. Her father, Robert Hartwell, was a proud man who had spent 20 years trying to outrun a series of bad decisions with a series of slightly better ones, and by the time Evelyn was 12, she could read a cattle ledger and identify 3 kinds of disease in a herd by the way they moved. Not because her father sat her down and taught her, because she watched, because she asked questions that nobody answered and then found the answers herself in whatever book she could get her hands on: veterinary texts, agricultural journals, a correspondence course in land management she had paid for herself with 2 summers of helping neighbors during calving season. She was 24 when her father came to her with the Reeves proposal. He didn't call it a marriage, he called it a merger. She noticed the distinction and didn't comment on it. "The Reeves family controls water rights on the North Ridge," he said, spreading a map across the kitchen table like he was briefing a general rather than asking his daughter to marry a stranger. "If we join the operations, we stabilize both lines. Their cash flow covers our debt through the winter. Our eastern pasture gives them the grazing expansion they've been after for 3 years." "And what does Colton Reeves get?" Evelyn said. Her father's eyes moved away from the map. "A wife. That's not an answer." "Evelyn, it's not an answer, Papa." She kept her voice level, the way she'd learned to do when she needed him to keep talking rather than shut down. "What does he actually want from this?" Robert Hartwell folded his hands on the table. He was a man who had aged faster than his years, and in that moment, in the yellow kitchen light, he looked like a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally decided to set it down on someone else. "He wants the Hartwell name attached to a legitimate land claim on the southeastern quarter. There's a dispute with Moreland, you know the Moreland family, over grazing boundaries. A marriage gives the Reeves operation a cleaner legal standing. So she was a document. That was fine. She'd been treated as less consequential things. "Does he know I've been managing the East herd since I was 19? She asked. "I mentioned it." "What did he say?" Her father looked at the map again. "He said that was nice." The train ride to Billings took 11 hours. Evelyn spent most of it reading a pamphlet on rotational grazing that a professor at the agricultural college had sent her in response to a letter she'd written 3 months prior. She'd never met the man. She'd simply written him a 4-page letter laying out what she'd observed about overgrazing in the valley's eastern corridor and asking whether her hypothesis about soil nitrogen depletion matched what the research suggested. He'd written back 12 pages. She'd written back 6. They'd been corresponding ever since. She read the pamphlet twice and took notes in the margins in her small, tight handwriting. Then she folded it into her bag and watched Montana go by outside the window and tried not to think about what she was riding toward. The Reeves Ranch spread itself across the land like it had always been there and always intended to stay. 3 times the size of anything Evelyn had grown up around, with a main house that had a 2nd floor and a barn that could have swallowed her father's entire operation. She took it in through the carriage window and felt something complicated move through her. Not envy exactly, but something close to it, mixed with a cooler, steadier feeling that she couldn't name until later, when she realized it was the particular alertness that comes before a long piece of work. Colton Reeves met her at the door. He was taller than she'd expected and harder-faced. The kind of man who had grown up being told he was right about things and had started to carry that in his jaw. He shook her hand like she was a business associate and led her inside without asking about the journey. His mother, Margaret Reeves, stood in the hallway and looked Evelyn over in the way that older women of a certain kind of pride look over things they have already decided about. She was not unkind exactly. She was thorough. "You're smaller than I imagined," Margaret said. "I'm taller than I look," Evelyn said, and Margaret blinked, and that was the first honest moment of the whole arrangement. The contract conversation happened that evening. She'd been shown to a room, a spare room, on the far end of the house from the family rooms, which told her several things at once, and been given an hour to settle. Then a hand knocked and said Mr. Reeves would see her in the study. She'd gone downstairs expecting a conversation. She'd gotten a document sliding off a table. "Sign it or don't," Colton said. "Either way, you're here because your father ran out of options, not because anyone wanted you." Evelyn picked the contract up from the floor and read it. All of it. Standing at the edge of his desk while he watched her with the particular impatience of a man who expected people to either comply immediately or flinch. She did neither. She read the contract carefully, because it mattered, and because reading it carefully was the one thing he clearly hadn't expected her to do. There were clauses she'd have argued with if she'd had a lawyer. There were terms that made clear the Reeves family's attorneys had done their work, and her father's had not. There was a line about management decisions on any jointly held land requiring the approval of the senior Reeves family representative, which in practice meant Colton, which meant her. She looked up when she finished. "Paragraph 14, she said. "Management decisions clause. That needs to be amended." He stared at her. "Excuse me?" "As written, I can't make any decisions about land use on the Eastern Quarter without your sign-off. That defeats the purpose of the merger if I'm the one managing that sector." "You won't be managing anything." "Then why is my name on this document?" The silence had weight to it. Margaret, still in the doorway, had gone very still. "Your name on that document," Colton said, "because your father needed it there and I needed the legal claim. That's the whole of it." "And the Eastern Quarter management?" "Will be handled by my foreman." Evelyn set the contract back on his desk, not sliding it, placing it carefully with both hands. "I see." She looked at him for a moment. "I'll sign it, but I want it noted, somewhere, even in a letter your attorney keeps, that I objected to paragraph 14. "Why?" It wasn't really a question. It was more the sound a man makes when he's waiting for something so he can dismiss it. "Because in 2 years, Evelyn said, you're going to want someone to blame for the decisions that got made about that land, and I'd prefer the record show clearly that I wasn't the one making them." She signed the contract. She went back to her room. She lay on the spare bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about paragraph 14 and the soil report she'd been building in her head for 6 months about the southeastern quarter and what she already knew about the water table in this particular stretch of Montana, which was more than Colton Reeves knew she knew, which was more than he'd thought to ask about. She wasn't angry. She'd expected this, or something close to it. What she hadn't expected was how complete his contempt was, how total, how almost administrative in its indifference to the possibility that she might be worth something. That was the part that surprised her, not the cruelty of it, the efficiency. She let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly as long as it took to understand it. Then she folded it somewhere internal, the way you fold a paper you're not done with but don't need right now, and she went to sleep. The first month at the Reeves Ranch was a particular kind of education. She learned the rhythms of a household that didn't include her. The hands ate breakfast at 5:30, and she was not invited. Ranch decisions happened in the main room after dinner, and she was not consulted. When she offered to ride out and look at the condition of the East herd, because she'd seen 3 of the animals from a distance and noted something in the way they moved, Colton's foreman, a weathered man named Dutch Alderman, looked at her like she'd suggested something mildly offensive. "Mr. Reeves handles the herd assessments," Dutch said. "I wasn't asking Mr. Reeves," Evelyn said. "I was asking if I could ride out." "Ma'am, with respect—" "How about without respect?" she said. "How about you just tell me plainly?" Dutch had not known what to do with that, and so he'd done what people often do when they don't know what to do. He'd walked away. She rode out anyway. 2 days later, on a Tuesday morning, while Colton was in town meeting with a bank representative about a line of credit she'd also not been told about, She took the smaller roan from the stable and went east and spent 4 hours with the herd, which was not in good condition. They were underweight in ways that didn't match the feed logs she'd found in the barn office, which she'd found by going into the barn office and reading everything on the shelves, which nobody had told her not to do. 3 of the cows had the early signs of something she recognized. She'd seen it once before on her father's ranch, in a particularly bad autumn. It was treatable if you caught it early. If you didn't catch it early, it moved. She came back and wrote everything down in the notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. Observations, dates, the particular notations she used for cattle health that her father had never understood, and her professor correspondent in Billings had called unusually systematic for a self-taught rancher. She was not self-taught exactly. She had taught herself, which was a different thing. That evening she knocked on the study door. Colton looked up from his desk with the expression of a man being interrupted by something he had not scheduled and did not welcome. "The East herd," she said. 3 of the cows have early signs of bovine respiratory disease. The feed-to-weight ratios in the barn logs suggest they've been underfed through the last rotation, which has weakened their immune function. You need to treat them now, not when you get to it. He looked at her for a long moment. "I didn't ask for a herd report." "No," she said. "But you need one. Dutch handles the herd." Dutch didn't catch this. "How would you know?" "Because it's not in the logs and the animals are sick." She opened her notebook and set it on his desk without asking whether she could. "These are my observations from this morning. The affected cows are the 2 brown roan heifers on the northeast corner and the older black cow your foreman has listed as number 7 in the fall inventory. If you start treatment in the next 48 hours, you'll lose none of them. If you wait a week, you'll probably lose all 3 and risk transmission to the others." Colton looked at the notebook. He did not pick it up. "You rode out to the East herd," he said. "Yes." "I didn't authorize that." "No," she said again. "You didn't." The silence stretched out. She could feel him working through something. Not the cattle, she thought, but the fact of her. The fact that she had gone and done a thing without his permission and come back with information he didn't have and needed. "I'll talk to Dutch," he said finally. "The notebook has everything he'll need." She took it back from his desk. "I'll write up a clean copy." She left without waiting to see his face. Dutch treated the cows the next morning. She watched from a distance and didn't say anything about watching. All 3 animals recovered. Nobody mentioned it to her, not directly, but she noticed that Dutch stopped walking away from her when she appeared in the barn. He didn't talk to her much, but he stopped walking away, and that was something. Colton did not mention the cattle or the notebook or the ride she'd taken without permission. But 2 weeks later, when she came down early and found the feed log sitting on the kitchen table, left there by no one in particular apparently, she understood it was the closest thing to acknowledgement she was going to get, and she sat down and went through every entry for the previous 6 months, and wrote down everything that was wrong with the way the rotation had been managed, and said nothing about it to anyone, and kept building what she was building. She wrote to her professor correspondent in Billings. She described the land she'd been able to observe, the soil color, the drainage patterns in the south pasture, the way water pooled after rain in places that suggested something underneath. She described what she'd read about the abandoned quarter section to the west of the Reeves property line, the land everyone in the county called the Dead 40, which had been sitting untouched for 11 years after its previous owner walked away from a debt. Her correspondent wrote back promptly, as he always did. "Your observation about the pooling patterns is consistent with secondary aquifer indicators I've seen documented in 3 other Montana locations with similar topography," he wrote. "If you're right about what's underneath that land, the person who owns it will have access to water independent of the Northern Ridge rights. In a dry year, that's not a convenience, that's a lifeline." Evelyn read the letter 3 times. She folded it into her notebook. She looked out the window at the land she'd married into and thought about what she had and what she would need and how long she was willing to wait before she started moving. Not long, she decided. She'd been patient her whole life. She was good at it. But patience had never been her destination. It had always been her method, and she knew the difference, and she was ready to begin. The clean copy of the feed log sat on the corner of Evelyn's small writing desk for 3 days before she did anything with it. Not because she didn't know what to do, but because she was waiting for the right moment, and she had learned, through years of watching her father move too fast on things he should have approached sideways, that the right moment was rarely the first available one. She spent those 3 days learning the ranch the way she'd learned everything else in her life, by showing up and watching and asking questions that people didn't realize were questions. She talked to the stable hand about which pastures the horses favored and why. She talked to the cook, a broad-shouldered woman named Clara, who had been feeding the Reeves household for 11 years, about what the family ate during a hard winter versus a good one, because what a ranching family eats tells you more about their financial reality than any ledger. She walked the fence lines in the afternoon when the light was low and the land showed its shape most honestly, and she noted where the ground was soft when it shouldn't be and where it was hard when it shouldn't be, and she wrote it all down in the notebook she kept close enough to her body that it had started to carry her warmth. Colton ignored her with the focused energy of a man who had decided ignoring someone was a position rather than an avoidance. He ate at the same table and passed things without being asked and sometimes answered questions with more than 2 words. But his attention moved around her like water around a stone, and Evelyn watched this without comment and understood that it was information too. The letter from the Billings land office arrived on a Thursday. She'd written to them 6 weeks prior, requesting documentation on the dead 40, the abandoned quarter section to the west of the Reeves property line that had been sitting in legal limbo since its previous owner, a man named Cutter, had walked away from a debt and apparently kept walking. The land office letter was careful and bureaucratic and told her almost nothing directly, but between its lines she found what she needed. The parcel was available for private purchase. The outstanding debt against it had been cleared through county process the previous spring, and the asking price was low enough to make a person wonder what was wrong with it. She knew what was wrong with it. Everyone in the county knew what was wrong with it. The land was dry and rocky, and the previous owner had grazed it down to nothing before he left. So it sat there looking like a wound, and nobody wanted a wound when there was better land available. She wrote back to the land office the same afternoon and requested a formal purchase inquiry. Then she folded her copy of the letter into the notebook and went to find Clara to ask about dinner, because she was hungry and because she had learned to keep her largest thoughts quiet until they were ready. She did not tell Colton. Not that week, and not the week after. She told Dutch. Not all of it. She wasn't foolish enough to think Dutch would keep something that large from Colton, and she didn't need him to. She told him only that she'd been curious about the soil conditions to the west and asked if he'd ever had occasion to ride across the dead 40. Dutch had, years back. He described it the way everyone described it: rocky, useless, dead. She asked what he'd noticed about water in the area. Dutch had paused at that. "There's a draw runs along the western edge," he said slowly, like he was pulling something up from a long way down. "After a rain, water runs into it from 3 directions. I always thought it was just drainage." "Which directions?" Evelyn said. He told her. She went back to her room and redrew the topographic notes she'd been assembling in her head for 2 months, and looked at where the water ran and where it didn't, and what that meant about what might be underneath. And the picture that emerged was exactly what her Billings correspondent had suggested: not just drainage, but collection. The land held water below what anyone looking at the surface could see. The county assessor's records, which she had also written to separately, because she was thorough in the way only people who've had to be thorough without help tend to be, confirmed it. 2 attempts at well drilling on adjacent parcels in the 1880s had both hit water at depth. Nobody had connected the dots, because nobody had been looking at all 3 pieces of information at the same time. She was looking at all 3 pieces of information: her inheritance from her grandmother on her mother's side, money her father hadn't known about because her grandmother had given it to Evelyn directly, in a private letter with a bank draft tucked inside 3 years before she died, with a note that said simply for when you need to make your own move, was sitting in a Billings account that carried only Evelyn's name. It was not a large sum by Reeves standards. By her own standards, it was nearly everything she had. She sent the purchase inquiry. She made the deposit. She signed the papers that the land office sent back by return post. She owned the dead 40 on a Tuesday morning in March, and by Tuesday afternoon the news had moved through the county in the way that news in small communities moves. Not through any single conversation, but through a kind of atmospheric transmission, present everywhere before anyone could account for how it got there. Colton found out at 3 o'clock. She heard him before she saw him, the particular sound of his boots on the hardwood in the hallway, too fast and too hard, which was the closest thing to emotion she'd yet observed from him. He came through the doorway of the small sitting room where she'd been reading and stood there with the county purchase notice in his hand, and his face was the face of a man who had just been surprised by something he believed he had accounted for. "What is this?" he said. It was not a question. "It's a land purchase," she said. "I know what it is. I'm asking why." "Because the parcel was available and I believed it was worth acquiring." "That land is worth nothing." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not angry exactly, but tightly controlled in the way that anger gets when a man is trying to be careful with it. "Everyone in this county knows it's worth nothing." Cutter walked away from it. The Moreland family looked at it twice and passed. "It's been sitting empty for 11 years because there is nothing there." "The price reflected that," Evelyn said. "It's money wasted. Money that could have—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. "Where did you get it?" "We haven't paid you an allowance for—" "It's my money," she said, "from before the marriage." He looked at her with the focused attention of someone recalibrating. "You had a private account." "I still have it, slightly smaller now." "You didn't tell me." "There was nothing in our contract requiring me to disclose prior personal assets." She kept her voice even. Not cold, she'd learned that cold invited escalation, but level, in the way that level things resist tipping. "You'll find I'm fairly careful about contracts." He stood in the doorway for a moment that went on longer than was comfortable. She watched him decide something. "That land will drain whatever you put into it," he said. "There's no water access, no shelter, no—" "I'm aware of what it looks like from the road," Evelyn said. He left the room. Not slamming anything, but he was a controlled man in his way, but with a purposeful speed that communicated what slamming would have. And she listened to his footsteps recede and let out a breath that she hadn't realized she'd been holding for approximately 10 minutes. Margaret Reeves appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later. She moved quietly for a woman her age, and she had the habit of appearing in places slightly after trouble, which gave her a quality of omniscience that Evelyn suspected was entirely deliberate. "You bought the Cutter parcel," Margaret said. "Yes." "With your own money?" "Yes." Margaret sat down in the chair across from her without being invited, which was a habit she had that Evelyn had stopped minding. "My son thinks you're being reckless." "I know." "Are you?" Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Margaret Reeves was not an easy woman to read, and she'd stopped trying to read her in simple ways. "No," she said, "but I understand why it looks that way." "Will you tell me why you bought it?" "Not yet." Margaret considered that. She had the stillness of someone who had lived in a ranching household for 40 years and learned that the land eventually tells you what it intends if you stop demanding answers on your own schedule. "All right," she said, and got up and left. And that was the whole of it. The community's reaction arrived in stages. First came the curiosity, the kind of sideways attention that passes as friendliness in rural places, the extra questions when she came into town, the neighbors who found reasons to ride past the dead 40 and look at it with new interest now that someone had paid actual money for it. She answered every question the same way. She thought the land had potential she was interested in exploring. Nobody believed her, because nobody had reason to yet, and she wasn't offering them one. Then came the amusement. There was a woman named Helen Barker, wife of the largest independent rancher in the eastern part of the county, who said things at social gatherings in the tone of someone being generous. She said she supposed it was sweet that the Reeves bride was finding hobbies. She said she'd heard the Hartwell family had always been creative about their land decisions. She said it with a smile that fit her face well, and the women around her laughed with the comfortable laughter of people laughing at something that didn't cost them anything. Evelyn heard about it secondhand because she had not been at the gathering. She'd been at the Dead 40 with a set of surveying tools she'd borrowed from the county land office, mapping drainage lines. She wrote to her Billings correspondent that week and asked for the name of a well driller who had experience in secondary aquifer work. He wrote back with 2 names and a note that said he hoped she was right about what she thought she'd found, because if she was, it was going to be remarkable. The well driller she hired was a man named Patterson, 60 years old, skeptical in the particular way of experienced tradespeople who have watched too many confident people be wrong. He came out to the Dead 40 on a cold April morning and looked at her drainage maps and listened to her explain the topography and the well records from the adjacent parcels, and then he stood there for a while looking at the land. "If you're right," he said, "you've got water at about 60 feet in that northeastern corner." "And if I'm wrong?" "Then you've spent money on a dry hole, and I've spent 2 days out here for nothing. and we'll both go home. Fair enough, she said. Start in the northeastern corner. Patterson hit water at 53 feet. He stood at the edge of the well and looked at her, and she could see him reorganizing some interior understanding. There's another probable location 30 yards south-southwest, Evelyn said. The drainage pattern suggests a secondary collection point. He drilled the second well the next day. Water at 48 feet. Word moved through the county faster than she'd expected. By the weekend, 3 men had come out to look at what she'd done, one of them being Marcus Holt, who managed the Moreland operation and had passed on the dead 40 twice on behalf of his employers. He stood at the edge of the first well and said nothing for a long time. I walked this ground, he said finally. I know, Evelyn said. We hired a man to assess it. I know. He looked at her. What did he miss? He was looking at surface indicators. The surface here is genuinely poor. Cutters stripped the topsoil badly. You have to look at drainage convergence over a wider area and cross-reference with historical well records from the adjacent parcels. And you did that. Yes. He nodded slowly, the way men nod when they're deciding how to feel about being outmaneuvered by someone they hadn't considered a competitor. Then he got on his horse and rode back toward the Moreland Range, and she watched him go and turned back to the work. Colton came to see the wells on a Saturday. She hadn't told him Patterson was coming, and she hadn't told him about the drilling, and by the time he heard about it from Dutch, who had heard it from the feed store, which had heard it from Patterson's assistant, both wells were already producing, and she'd already hired a man to begin fencing the northeastern corner. Colton rode out alone and stood at the first well for a long time without speaking, and she let the silence exist because she had things to say, and she wanted him to run out of words before she used hers. You knew, he said. I believed, she said. There's a difference. I believed enough to risk the money. I wasn't certain until Patterson drilled. You could have told me. You'd have told me it was reckless. He looked at her with something complicated in his expression. Not quite anger, not quite the dismissal she'd gotten used to, but something that lived in the space between them and didn't have a name yet. Maybe I would have, he said. I know, she said. That's why I didn't. He walked the fence line she'd started and looked at the drainage marks she'd flagged and picked up one of her surveying stakes and turned it in his hands like it was a question he was trying to understand the shape of. She watched him think and didn't interrupt it because she could see something happening in him that was worth letting happen. The water rights on this parcel, he said. They're registered in your name. Yes. Separate from the ranch operation. Yes. He set the stake down. That was deliberate. Everything I do is deliberate, she said. It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact, and she said it plainly enough that he understood the difference. He rode back to the main house without saying anything else. That evening at dinner, for the first time since she'd arrived, he asked her directly what she planned to do with the land. Not dismissively, not with the tone of tolerating a child's explanation. He asked with the focused attention of a man beginning to understand that he'd been miscounting something important. She told him about the breeding program. She'd been building the plan in her head and on paper for 2 months. A crossbreeding protocol designed to introduce genetics from drought-resistant stock into the existing Reeves herd, which had been bred for size over several generations at the cost of resilience. The cattle were heavy, but they broke badly in hard winters. She wanted animals that could handle Montana in the bad years, not just the good ones. She'd been corresponding with a rancher in Texas who had spent 15 years developing exactly the kind of genetic line she was looking for, and she had a price on a small introductory group of animals that was higher than comfortable but lower than the value they'd produce. Colton listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was the first time he had done that. You want to bring in Texas stock, he said when she finished. 6 animals to start, 2 bulls and 4 heifers, to cross with the existing herd over 3 seasons. The hands won't like it. Dutch runs a traditional operation. I'm aware of that. The genetics take years to show results. 3 years for the first crossbred generation to reach productive age. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. And if the drought comes before 3 years? The water I found on the dead 40 buys us time the rest of the county won't have. That's the point of having it. Margaret, at the end of the table, was very carefully not looking at either of them. Colton picked up his fork. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He said, I'll think about it. And she accepted that because it was the first time he'd said anything that wasn't a dismissal, and she had learned that the distance between "I'll think about it" and "yes" was shorter than the distance between dismissal and everything else. The Texas stock arrived in May, on a train that was 2 hours late, in a cattle car that had not been cleaned well enough for Evelyn's satisfaction. She'd ridden into Billings herself to receive them, and stood in the rail yard watching the animals come down the ramp with the particular attention she gave to anything she'd put money on, and they were good animals, rangy and hard-muscled in the way of cattle that had survived real heat, with eyes that were alert rather than dull, which mattered in ways that took too long to explain to people who hadn't grown up reading cattle. Dutch was at the rail yard. She hadn't invited him. He'd come on his own, which told her something. He stood beside her and watched the animals and said nothing for a long time. "The bulls are smaller than ours," he said. "Yes." "The hands are going to think you downgraded." "The hands can look at the weight records in 3 years," she said. Dutch made a sound that might have been a laugh, suppressed before it completed itself. "Where do you want to pen them?" She'd prepared for that question. She told him exactly where and why, and which existing animals she wanted them near first based on temperament, and she watched Dutch listen and saw him filing things away with the particular attention of a man who had stopped deciding in advance that he already knew more than the person talking. It wasn't warmth, it wasn't even respect yet, but it was something adjacent to both, and she'd take it. The real trouble arrived in June. It came in the form of Dale Moreland himself. Not Marcus Holt, the manager, but the man who owned the Moreland operation, who was 63 years old and carried himself like a man who had been the most significant person in a room for so long that he'd stopped noticing he was doing it. He came to the Reeves Ranch on a Tuesday with 2 associates and requested a meeting with Colton. And because Colton's study door was closed and she was in the hallway with a letter she'd come to post, she was the first person he encountered. Moreland looked at her the way he'd look at something that had appeared in an unexpected location. "Mrs. Reeves," he said, with a smile that was entirely surface. "I heard you'd settled in." "Mr. Moreland," she said, "Colton's in his study. I'll let him know you're here." "I also heard about your little water project." She paused. "Not long." "Did you?" "Resourceful," he said. The word carried the tone of a compliment that wasn't. "Cutter's land. Who would have thought?" He turned the smile up slightly, and his 2 associates arranged themselves behind him with the practiced ease of men who existed to be arranged behind someone. "I expect you'll be putting it to good use." "I expect so." "I'd be interested," Moreland said, "in discussing a partnership arrangement, water sharing on favorable terms. It would benefit both operations, and the Reeves family and I have always had a productive relationship." "I'm sure Colton would want to hear any proposal you have," Evelyn said. "Of course." He let the smile sit there a moment longer than necessary. "I always find it's good to know who makes the decisions on a property. Saves time." She looked at him steadily. "I'll let him know you're here," she said again, and went to knock on the study door. Colton took the meeting. She was not invited to attend, which she had expected. She went to the barn and worked with the new stock for 2 hours and tried not to think about what was being said, because she could imagine it well enough, and imagining it wasn't useful. Dutch found her in the barn late afternoon. "Moreland was here," he said, in the tone of a man confirming something she already knew. "I know. I met him at the door. He's been buying up water rights across the county, 3 parcels in the last 18 months. Dutch picked up a piece of tack and turned it over in his hands, which was something he did when he was about to say something he wasn't sure how to say. "Mr. Reeves?" He stopped. "What did Colton tell him?" Dutch was quiet for a moment. "He didn't say no." She kept her hands on the animal in front of her. The heifer was warm and solid under her palms, and she focused on that for a second before she spoke. "About what, specifically?" "About a future arrangement on your water parcel. Moreland's interested in usage rights. Colton said he'd consider it." Dutch set the tack down. "I thought you should know." She thanked him. She meant it. Then she waited until he'd left the barn and let herself feel that anger for a full 30 seconds. Not the cold administrative kind, but the real kind, the kind that had heat in it, because it was real, and she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. Then she folded it back in. The parcel was in her name. That was the important thing. The water rights were registered to Evelyn Hartwell Reeves, not to the Reeves Ranch operation, not to Colton, not to the joint enterprise their contract described. She had done that deliberately and filed it correctly and paid a billings attorney $20 to review the registration to make sure it was clean, and it was. Colton couldn't offer Moreland anything she didn't agree to. The question was whether he knew that. She went to his study after dinner. He was still there, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that he looked tired. Not physically tired, but the other kind. The kind that comes from spending several hours in a room with a man who is better at the particular game being played and knowing it. Moreland wants usage rights to the Dead 40 water, she said. He looked up. We discussed possibilities. The water rights are registered in my name. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when someone realizes they've moved a piece without checking what else it connects to. I'm aware of that, he said. He said it in the tone of a man who had, approximately in the last 2 hours, become aware of that. Then you understand that any arrangement with Moreland about that water requires my agreement. Yes. Do you want to make an arrangement with Moreland about that water? He looked at her for a long moment. She watched him work through it. The politics of the county, the long relationship between the Reeves and Moreland families, the particular weight of a man like Dale Moreland sitting across a desk and suggesting that things would go better for everyone if they were cooperative. She knew those weights. She'd grown up watching her father buckle under lighter ones. He made an offer that isn't unreasonable, Colton said carefully. What did he offer? He told her. She listened to the whole thing without reacting, because she'd learned that reacting was what people were waiting for, and if you didn't give it to them, you got more information than you otherwise would have. The offer was reasonable on its face, which was exactly how Dale Moreland operated, reasonable on the face, binding in the fine print, and structured so that in a drought year, which was coming, the usage terms would give Moreland effective control over water that would otherwise be entirely hers. The answer is no, she said. Evelyn, not forever, not on principle. The answer to this specific offer is no. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, which she rarely did, and he noticed the difference because he noticed most things, even when he pretended not to. If Moreland wants access to water on the Dead 40, he can pay fair market rate for it, in a contract that doesn't include usage control language during shortage periods. I'll draft what reasonable terms look like and you can take them to him. You'll draft them. I know what the contract should say. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the expression she was coming to recognize, the one where he was trying to decide whether to fight the thing in front of him or use it. He won't like it. No, she said. He won't. Moreland has relationships across this county that... I know what Moreland has, she said, and I know that a man who has spent 18 months quietly buying up water rights across a county that's heading into drought isn't looking for partnerships. He's building a chokehold, and the only thing that stops it is someone who has water he can't access. She met his eyes. That someone is me. So the question isn't whether Moreland likes the terms. The question is whether you want to be on the right side of what's coming. The room was quiet. Outside, the wind was doing what Montana wind did, working at everything with patient, indifferent force. Colton picked up the pen on his desk and turned it in his fingers. It was a habit she'd noticed, something he did when he was thinking hard and not ready to let the thinking show. She waited. Write the terms, he said. She wrote them that night at the small desk in her room, by lamplight, with her notebook open beside her and the billings attorney's guidance in her head. She wrote carefully and without flourish, because a contract that was going to protect something real didn't need flourish. It needed precision. She finished near midnight and read it back once and changed 2 phrases that weren't tight enough and read it again and set it aside. Then she sat there in the quiet for a moment, listening to the house settle around her. The big, proud, struggling house that she'd arrived at as a burden and a document and a woman nobody had wanted. And she thought about the water under the dead land and the animals in the barn and the breeding record she was building season by season and the attorney in Billings who had her water rights filed correctly and the notebook full of observations that nobody had thought to be afraid of. She thought about what Moreland was building and what she was building and the difference between a man who bought things to control them and a woman who found things nobody else had thought to look for. Then she turned down the lamp and went to sleep because tomorrow was going to be a long day, and she had learned a long time ago that you couldn't do anything useful if you didn't sleep. Moreland's response to the counterterms arrived not by letter but by silence, which was its own kind of answer. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. Colton checked the post with a regularity that he didn't mention and she didn't comment on, and the silence from the moorland operation stretched out like the dry summer that had been settling over the county since June. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a persistent absence of what was needed. The creek levels dropped. The grass came in thin. 3 neighboring ranchers lost animals to heat exhaustion before August, and the conversations in town shifted from politics and cattle prices to water, always water, the way conversations in ranching country always eventually come back to the one thing you can't manufacture or argue your way into having. The dead 40 wells held. She'd had Patterson come back in July to assess the output, and he'd spent half a day with her measurements and her drainage maps and told her what she already suspected. The aquifer she'd tapped was deep enough and broad enough to sustain meaningful draw through a dry season without depleting. Not forever, and not under unlimited use, but through what was coming, through what the almanac suggested was coming and what her own reading of the land had been telling her all spring. She put the crossbred heifers on the dead 40's northeastern pasture, where the first well gave her reliable water access, and the ground, rocky as it was, had begun to show the first thin signs of recovery now that something was growing on it instead of nothing. The animals adapted to the ground faster than she'd expected. The Texas genetics gave them a tolerance for discomfort that the Reeves herd's more pampered bloodlines hadn't developed. Dutch watched this happen and didn't say he was impressed, but he started asking questions that only an impressed man asks. The disease came in September. She heard about it first from a hand named Garrett, who rode in from the northern pasture on a Wednesday morning with his face arranged in the way that faces arrange themselves. When a man is carrying news, he doesn't want to be the one to carry. He found Dutch first, and Dutch found Colton, and by the time Evelyn heard about it, she'd already seen 3 of the main herd animals moving wrong from her window. That particular stiff, reluctant gait that she'd learned to read before she could read a sentence. She went to the barn without being asked. Dutch was already there with Colton, and the ranch's regular veterinarian, a man named Greer, who had been servicing the Reeves operation for a decade, was crouched beside one of the affected animals with his bag open and his expression closed, in the way that veterinarians' expressions close when the news is not preliminary and manageable, but confirmed and serious. Bovine respiratory complex, Greer said when she came in. But it's not presenting the way I'd expect. The progression is faster. The fever onset is inside 24 hours, which means by the time an animal shows symptoms, they've likely been contagious for a full day already. Colton had his arms crossed and was looking at the animal with the expression he used when he was calculating something. How many? 7 confirmed in this barn. I'd want to check the north pasture animals before I give you a number for the whole herd. It's moving through them faster because of the dry summer, Evelyn said. Everyone looked at her. She was standing at the edge of the group, and she spoke directly to Greer because Greer was the one with the information she needed. Stress suppresses immune response. They've been running on reduced water and shorter grass for 3 months. Their resistance is lower than it should be. Greer nodded once. That's consistent. What about the crossbred animals on the dead 40 pasture? Haven't checked them yet. I want to check them now, she said. Colton started to say something, and she looked at him. Not aggressively, but with the particular directness that she used when there wasn't time for the usual negotiation of whether she was allowed to speak. He stopped. She and Greer rode out to the dead 40 together. The crossbred animals were in the northeastern corner, 7 of them, and she checked each one with the systematic attention she brought to everything and found not nothing, because 2 of them had slightly elevated temperatures that she wouldn't have caught without a thermometer set. But no full presentation, no fast-moving fever, no respiratory distress. The crossbred genetics, Greer said, watching her work. You think it's the genetics? Partly. And partly the water. They've had consistent access to good water all summer. They're not stressed. She straightened up from the last animal. The main herd has been running low on the North Pasture Creek since July. Stress plus a drier immune system means when something gets in, it gets in fast. Greer was quiet for a moment. I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 22 years, he said. The correlation you're describing between water stress and disease susceptibility, I've seen it happen, but I haven't seen a rancher put it together that clearly before. It's in the literature, she said. The agricultural journals. There was a piece in the 1889 edition of the Livestock Husbandry Review that documented it across 3 separate outbreaks. He looked at her with the particular expression of someone recalibrating. "You read the Livestock Husbandry Review." "I have a subscription," she said, and got back on her horse. The next 2 weeks were the hardest she'd had since arriving at the Reeves Ranch, and the hardest she'd had were already not easy. She worked 18-hour days without meaning to, because the work simply expanded to fill the available hours, and there were things that needed doing that only she knew how to do, and she wasn't built to leave them undone. She set up a quarantine protocol that she'd read about in a disease management pamphlet her Billings correspondent had sent her the previous winter. Isolation pens, separate water sources, a tracking system for each animal that let her log temperature twice daily and catch deterioration before it became crisis. She taught 2 of the younger hands how to use the tracking system because she couldn't be in 3 places at once and didn't try to be. Colton helped. That was the part she hadn't fully anticipated, not in the way she helped. He didn't have the background in disease progression or the specific knowledge she'd accumulated, but in the way of a man who was capable and present and had stopped, sometime in those first days of the outbreak, deciding in advance that her approach was wrong. He moved animals when she said move them. He organized the hands into the shift schedule she'd drawn up. He rode out at 2 in the morning on a Thursday, because Garrett had reported a new animal down in the West Pen, and she'd been awake since midnight with 2 animals in crisis and couldn't leave them, and Colton had gone himself without being asked, which was the first time he'd done something because the situation required it rather than because he'd approved it. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it because there wasn't time, and because saying something about it would have made it strange, and she didn't want to make it strange. The news that the disease had moved beyond the Reeves Ranch came on a Friday afternoon from Marcus Holt, who rode up to the main house looking like a man who had put aside whatever grudge he was carrying because there were things that mattered more than grudges. "It's in the Moreland herd," he said to Colton, "and the Briggs operation on the South Road. And I heard this morning it's in 2 smaller outfits on the eastern quarter." Evelyn was standing in the doorway of the barn, and she heard this. "What's Moreland doing?" Colton said. Holt's jaw tightened slightly. "Mr. Moreland has consulted with his veterinarian. They're treating individually as animals present symptoms." "That's not going to work," Evelyn said. Holt looked at her. "Mrs. Reeves, individual treatment after presentation is too slow for this strain. By the time an animal shows symptoms in this outbreak, it's been contagious for 24 hours. You have to quarantine before presentation, based on exposure tracking. Otherwise, you're always behind it." Holt was quiet. He had the expression of a man absorbing information he didn't like having to absorb from the source he was absorbing it from. "We have a protocol," she said. "It's working here. The numbers are stabilizing." She looked at him directly. "I can write it up. Anyone in the county can use it." He looked at Colton, who said nothing, which was his way of deferring, which she was still getting used to. "I'll take whatever you have," Holt said. She spent 2 hours that evening writing up the protocol. Every step, in plain language, with the reasoning behind each decision explained clearly because people follow protocols better when they understand why. She wrote it for ranchers, not veterinarians, because ranchers were the ones who were going to be implementing it at 2 in the morning in bad weather with tired hands. She wrote it the way she would have wanted someone to write it for her if she'd been the one who didn't know. She gave it to Holt. He took it back to the Moreland operation. The following week, 3 more families came to the Reeves Ranch asking for the same document. She gave it to all of them. Clara started making extra coffee in the mornings because there were often people at the kitchen table early, and Evelyn had developed the habit of answering questions with a directness that people found either useful or startling, and sometimes both. The sabotage started quietly, the way serious damage usually starts. She almost didn't recognize it for what it was. The first sign was the water line on the Dead 40's northeastern corner. A section of pipe she'd had installed to run water from the primary well to the quarantine pen she'd set up for the crossbred animals. It was cut clean through one morning, the kind of cut that doesn't happen by accident and doesn't happen from wear. She found it herself, early, before the hands were out, when she'd gone to check on the quarantine pen animals and found them without water. She fixed the line. She didn't say anything to Colton, not immediately, because she wanted to know if it happened again before she named it. It happened again. The water line on the second well this time, cut in a different place, in a way that suggested someone who had taken more care, who had studied the setup and found a spot that would be harder to notice and slower to trace. She found that one too. She went to Dutch. Both cuts are clean, she said. Not frayed, not worn. Someone with a good blade and enough time to get to both locations without being seen. Dutch's face did the thing it did when he was angry and managing it. When? Sometime between last Thursday evening and Friday morning on the first one. The second one I can't pin down as tightly. Sometime in the last 3 days. I'll talk to the hands. Don't, she said. Not yet. She'd thought about this. Whoever did this came from outside. Our people have been pulling double shifts for 2 weeks. They're tired, and they've been here. The cuts are in locations someone would have to ride out specifically to find. That means someone who knew what to look for. Dutch was quiet. Moreland has been on this property once, she said. His manager has been here twice. The water lines weren't installed yet on either visit, but someone's been watching. That's a serious accusation. I'm not accusing anyone, she said. I'm telling you what the evidence suggests. I haven't told Colton yet. I'm telling you first because you know this county and I want your read on it. Dutch turned and looked out at the pasture for a moment. When he turned back, his face had settled into something older and harder. Moreland's been trying to consolidate water control in this county for 2 years, he said. You sitting on a working aquifer with registered rights that he can't touch. That's a problem for him. Not a small one. I know, she said. You should tell Colton. I'm going to, she said. Tonight. She told Colton that night in the study, with the door closed and the lamp up, sitting across from him with both hands on the desk, and her voice flat and factual, because flat and factual was how she delivered things she was most upset about. She told him about the 2 cuts, her assessment of the timing, her reasoning about the source. She told him about Dutch's read on Moreland's countywide water strategy. She put her notebook on the desk and showed him the dates and her measurements and the notes she'd taken on the cut locations. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which she had come to understand was his version of taking something seriously. If it's Moreland, he said when she finished, I can't accuse him without proof. I know that. And even if I could, he's got enough political weight in this county that an accusation without proof would hurt us more than... I know that too, she said. I'm not asking you to accuse him. I'm asking you to know what I know. And I'm asking you to authorize me to set up a watch on the dead 40 property line for the next 2 weeks. 2 men, rotating, who know how to stay quiet and pay attention. He looked at her. You want to catch them? I want documentation. If this happens again and I have a witness with a clear account of what they saw, I have something I can take to the county sheriff and the land registrar, and if necessary, a territorial attorney. She met his eyes. Everyone around him will stay there with him. I intend to stop being in the gray. The watch started the following Monday. She chose the 2 hands herself, not based on loyalty to Colton, which was universal among the Reeves hands, but based on who she'd watched be quiet and observant over 6 months of working alongside them. One was Garrett, who had the useful quality of being forgettable looking in a landscape. The other was a younger man named Pete, who had come to her the previous week with a question about the quarantine protocol that had revealed him to be sharper than his age suggested. She briefed them herself. She was specific about what she wanted and why and what they should and shouldn't do. She told them their job was to watch and document and come to her, not to confront anyone, not to intervene, not to make decisions about what the situation required. Their job was information. What if someone's actively damaging property? Garrett said. You note it. You note the time. You note the description of who's doing it, and you come find me. And if you're not there, then you come find Mr. Reeves. But you come find me first. Pete raised his hand slightly. What if we see something, but it's too dark to make a good identification? Do the best you can and tell me exactly what you were and weren't able to see. Don't embellish. Don't fill in gaps. Just what you actually observed. She dismissed them. Then she went back to the barn to do her evening checks on the quarantine animals and found that 2 more of the main herd had developed symptoms and let herself feel the weight of that for a moment. Not despair, because she'd moved past the point where any single bad piece of news could find despair in her, but the honest weight of it. And then she went through the protocol steps the way she always did, one at a time, methodically, because that was the only way through anything. The storm came on the 4th week of October. Montana storms in late October carry a specific quality. They're not the dramatic thunderstorms of summer or the grinding blizzards of deep winter. They're the transitional ones, which are worse in some ways because they combine elements that don't usually go together, Rain that's almost sleet, wind that's sustained and directional and deeply cold, and the particular darkness of clouds that have no light in them anywhere. This storm started on a Wednesday afternoon and was fully established by midnight, and was the kind of thing that, in the morning, people described by saying they hadn't seen one like it in a decade. Evelyn was not asleep when it hit. She'd been in the barn since 10, not because she'd known the storm would be this bad. The signs had been there, but she'd misjudged the timing by a few hours. But because one of the quarantine animals was in respiratory distress that had been building since afternoon, and she wasn't going to leave it. She was kneeling in the straw with the animal when the barn walls started to move, in a way that made the lantern swing, and the other animals shift and make the particular noise that animals make when they've understood something humans haven't caught up to yet. She heard the gate before she saw what happened to it. The western gate of the Dead 40 property, she'd installed it herself, with hardware she'd ordered from a billing supplier because the local hardware had what she needed 2 weeks out, and she hadn't had 2 weeks, gave way in a wind gust that came from a direction nobody had expected. And in the rain and darkness she heard the cattle move before she heard the gate go, because the cattle knew what was happening a second before the sound of it reached her. She came out of the barn into the full force of the storm. She couldn't see past 10 yards. The rain was the kind that drives horizontally and finds every gap in a coat and gets into your eyes. She had her lantern, but the wind was working at it, and she had to shield it with her body while she moved, and she was already soaked through by the time she got to the fence line and understood the scale of what had happened. The gate was down, and at least 4 of the crossbred animals had gone through. She went back to the barn and got the roan, and didn't think about what she was doing in terms of risk, because risk assessment in a situation like this one is a luxury you don't actually have. You just do what needs doing. She got the horse and rode out into the storm with her lantern held low, where the wind had less reach, and she found the first animal 20 yards beyond the gate, standing in the confused way that cattle stand when they've moved somewhere unexpected and aren't sure if they meant to. She got the animal back through the gap before the gate, found the second one 40 yards further, near the draw on the western edge. Got that one back. Rode out further into the dark and the rain and the wind that came in cold gusts that made the roan shift and dance under her. And she talked to the horse the whole time. Not soothing talk, just continuous low talk. The kind that says, I'm here and I know what's happening and we're still working, which is what the horse needed and what she needed to say. She found the third and fourth animals together, further than she expected, near the eastern fence of the adjacent moorland property line. The moorland fence was intact and the animals were pushing against it, confused, and she got the roan between them and the fence and worked them back the way stock gets worked in bad weather, slowly, at the animal's pace, without drama. She was halfway back to the gate when she saw the light. It was a lantern, moving from the direction of the main Reeves house toward the Dead 40. And then she heard her name, Colton's voice, carrying over the wind with the effort of a man who has been calling for a while. She called back. The light changed direction. He found her with the 2 animals and the roan in the rain and the dark, and for a moment he just stood there with his lantern up, looking at her soaked coat and the cattle she'd already recovered, and the way she was positioned between the animals and the fence, and she saw something move through his expression that didn't resolve into anything she could name clearly because there was too much else happening. The gate went down, she said. I know, I heard it. He came forward and took the roan's lead so she could work the animals more freely. How many are out? 4. I've got 2 back. These are 3 and 4. Any injury? I don't know yet. The visibility? I know. He moved without being told, getting behind the animals on the far side so that she was pushing from one direction and he from the other, and they worked the cattle back through the gap in silence because they'd both done this kind of work long enough to know that the time for talking about it was after. She found the 5th animal herself, she'd miscounted in the dark, near the well housing, where it had apparently been sheltering since the gate went. Got it through. Colton had a rope on the gate and was holding it shut against the wind by the time she came through with the 5th animal, and she held the rope while he found a chain in his saddlebag and lashed the gate closed in a temporary fix that wasn't elegant but would hold the rest of the night. They rode back to the barn together. Inside, out of the wind, the noise level dropped enough that the particular quality of the silence between them was audible. She dismounted and checked the roan and then stood for a moment with her hands braced on the stall railing because her arms were tired and she was cold in the deep interior way that comes from extended effort in wet cold. where the temperature isn't extreme but has had a long time to work on you. You went out alone, Colton said. He was unsaddling his horse across the barn. Yes. In that, the animals were out. She didn't say obviously because she didn't need to. He was quiet for a moment. How long were you already out there when I found you? I don't know, 40 minutes, maybe. He turned around and looked at her across the barn. She was wet enough that her hair had given up its pins entirely and was flat against her neck, and she was aware of how she must look. Not the composed woman who wrote precise contract terms and quoted agricultural journals, but something rawer and more honest than that, which was either a problem or wasn't, and she was too tired to determine which. I should have... He started something and stopped. She looked at him. When this gate went, he said, I should have come sooner. She didn't say yes, you should have, and she didn't say it was fine, because neither of those was exactly true, and she was too tired to perform either. You came, she said. That mattered. He nodded once. He had the expression of someone who was carrying more than the conversation they were having, but she didn't push at it, because some things take the time they take. She went to check the quarantine animals she'd left. It had gotten worse while she was gone, which was what she'd feared but had accepted as the cost of going out for the others. She sat with it through the worst of the storm, checking vitals, adjusting what she could. Greer came out in the early morning, summoned by Colton. She hadn't asked anyone to call him. Colton had done it on his own, and between them they pulled the animal through what had been, at about 3 in the morning, a very uncertain hour. Greer left at dawn. She stayed. Dutch found her there at 7, sitting in the straw with the recovered animal, and he stood in the barn doorway for a moment before he said, Garrett came in an hour ago. She looked up. He and Pete, from the watch on the property line. Dutch's voice was careful in the way that it got when he was delivering something significant. They saw someone last night during the storm, on the Dead 40's western edge, near the drainage draw. She got up. One man, Dutch continued, working the gate latch. Pete got close enough. Wind was covering the sound, and saw his face in the lantern flash when the lightning came. Did he know him? He did. Dutch met her eyes. It was Moreland's head hand, a man named Carl Yates. She stood in the barn with the recovered animal breathing steadily behind her and the storm still draining off the roof outside, and the weight of that name sitting in the space between her and Dutch, like something that had just been put down after being carried a long way. Where's Garrett now? She said. Main house. Writing down everything he saw. His own words, his own handwriting, like you told them. Pete? Same. She nodded. Good. She looked down at her hands for a moment, still rough from the rope, from the hours in cold, wet dark. And then she looked back up at Dutch and felt the full weight of what she'd built over the past year. The wells, the breeding program, the disease protocol, the water rights in her name, and now this, a witnessed account in 2 sets of handwriting that described in plain language a man working a gate latch in a storm on her property. I need to speak with Colton, she said. He's in the house, Dutch said. He's been awake. She went to the house. She was still in her wet clothes from the night before, and she was tired in a way that went past the body and into something deeper. But she walked the way she always walked, without hurry, without drama, with the particular quality of stillness that she'd carried since she was 12 years old, watching her father struggle with a ranch that was too much for one man's pride to admit was struggling. Colton was at the kitchen table with a coffee cup, and the kind of face that people have when they haven't slept and know there's a reason they're still awake. She sat down across from him and told him what Dutch had told her. He listened. When she finished, he set the coffee cup down with a precision that meant he was containing something. Yates, he said. Yes. You're certain Pete could identify him in those conditions? In a lightning flash, with a face he knew, yes. She folded her hands on the table. I have 2 witness accounts being written right now. I have the dates and descriptions of both previous cut water lines in my notebook. I have the location, the documented damage, the timeline. She looked at him steadily. It's enough for the sheriff. It may be enough for a territorial court filing. Colton looked at her for a long time. Outside, the last of the storm was moving east, and the light coming through the kitchen window had the thin, washed quality of afterweather, the kind of light that makes everything visible that the dark had been covering. You planned for this, he said. I planned for the possibility, she said. There's a difference. He nodded. He was quiet for another moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not softened exactly, but different in the way of something that has been put under enough pressure to change its shape. I told Moreland I'd consider his water terms, he said. Back in June. I told you I'd think about it, and then I talked to him again without telling you, and I said I'd consider it. She had known this. She hadn't known he knew she knew it. I figured, she said. I was wrong to do that. She looked at him. Not just... He stopped. Started again. Not just strategically. It was wrong to you. He said it with the directness of a man who doesn't apologize easily and is therefore not practiced at the language of it. It came out plain and a little rough. The water rights are yours. I had no business discussing them without your knowledge. She sat with that for a moment. She wasn't going to dress it up with more grace than it deserved, and she wasn't going to diminish it either. Thank you, she said, for saying it. He nodded once. What do you need from me for the sheriff filing? A statement from you confirming the property boundary and the registered water rights, and your name on the complaint, alongside mine. A complaint from both of us carries more weight than one from me alone. He didn't hesitate. Done. She got up to get herself a coffee because she needed it and nobody else was going to do it, and she stood at the stove for a moment with her back to him and let the reality of the past 18 hours arrange itself into something she could carry. The gate in the storm, the animals in the dark, the witness accounts being written in 2 sets of handwriting in the next room, Colton across the kitchen table saying it was wrong to you in the rough way of a man who meant it. She poured the coffee. She turned around. The crossbred animals came through the night well, she said. All of them. I want you to see the comparison records when you have a moment, between their health metrics and the main herd over the past 6 weeks. Colton looked at her. I'll look at them this morning. After the sheriff, she said. After the sheriff, he agreed. She drank the coffee standing up because she didn't have time to sit, and outside the storm had fully passed and left Montana the way Montana looks after a hard night, raw and clear and absolutely indifferent to whatever the people living on it had been through, which was either brutal or honest, depending on how you thought about it. And Evelyn had long since decided it was honest, and honest was something she could work with. The sheriff's name was Caldwell, and he had the particular quality of a man who had been doing a difficult job in a small place for long enough that he'd learned to hear what people weren't saying as carefully as what they were. He came to the Reeves Ranch on the Thursday morning after the storm, 2 days after Evelyn had sent word through the county office, and he sat at the kitchen table with Garrett's written account and Pete's written account and Evelyn's notebook open in front of him and read everything with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who understood that the speed at which he moved now would determine what he could do later. Clara kept the coffee coming without being asked, which was her way of indicating she thought the matter was serious. And Margaret sat in the doorway of the adjoining room in a chair she'd carried from the parlor, not pretending she wasn't listening. Caldwell read Garrett's account twice. He asked 3 clarifying questions about the lightning conditions and the distance. Pete had been standing from Carl Yates and the exact configuration of the gate latch that had been worked. He asked these questions to Evelyn, not to Colton, which she noted without comment. The 2 prior waterline cuts, he said. You documented those at the time. Dates, locations, my description of the cuts and why they couldn't be accidental wear. She turned to the relevant pages in her notebook. The first one I found on a Friday morning, the second approximately 9 days later. You didn't report them then. I didn't have a witness account to support them then. I had my own documentation, which describes what I found, but nothing that put a person at the location. I wanted to build the complete picture before bringing it forward. Caldwell looked at her over the notebook. Most people would have come to me with the first cut. Most people would have lost their witness opportunity doing that, she said. Whoever was doing this would have known I'd reported it and stopped, and I'd have had damage and no account of who caused it. He was quiet for a moment. You set up the watch before you knew there'd be a storm. Yes. The storm was incidental. It may have been the reason Yates moved when he did. He'd have calculated that nobody would be watching in those conditions. She paused. He was wrong about that. Caldwell closed the notebook and folded his hands on top of it. He was a man in his mid-50s with a face that had been worked over by Montana weather into something that didn't give much away. Dale Moreland is not a man who takes accusations lightly, he said. I'm not making accusations, Evelyn said. I'm filing a complaint with documented evidence of criminal property damage and a witness account naming the individual observed in the act. What connection that individual has to his employer is a question for the investigation. Caldwell looked at Colton, who was sitting at the far end of the table and had said almost nothing during the entire conversation. You're in agreement with your wife on this filing? I am, Colton said. You understand this is likely to create a significant conflict with the Moreland operation. I understand that, Colton said. File the complaint. Caldwell left with the witness accounts and Evelyn's documented notebook pages. She'd made copies because she'd anticipated needing to surrender originals and had spent 2 evenings reproducing every relevant entry in her second notebook, and the complaint document that she and Colton had both signed the previous evening at the kitchen table with Clara as witness. She stood at the window and watched him ride out. The morning had the clean, cold quality that October mornings in Montana have after a storm has scoured everything, and the light fell across the dead 40 pasture in the distance, and she could see the crossbred animals moving in the northeast corner, easy and unhurried, eating well. He's going to tread carefully, Colton said, coming to stand beside her. I know. Moreland has had the county sheriff's political support for 15 years. Caldwell isn't going to move fast on this. He doesn't have to move fast, she said. He just has to move. What Caldwell's investigation produced over the following 6 weeks was a cautious, documented, and ultimately undeniable record. Carl Yates, when interviewed at the Moreland property, gave 3 different versions of his whereabouts on the night of the storm in 3 consecutive conversations with the sheriff's deputy, and the third version contradicted the first in ways that were difficult to explain. 2 of the Moreland operations hands, interviewed separately, placed Yates off the property that night, and a hardware store in the nearest town had a sales record for a specific kind of cutting tool, the kind that made clean cuts rather than frayed ones, purchased by a man matching Yates's description 6 weeks before the first waterline cut. None of this was dramatic. It was paperwork and contradictions and a hardware receipt and 2 men who hadn't liked being asked to lie under oath about where their colleague had been. It was exactly the kind of evidence that doesn't make a good story, but makes an airtight case, and Evelyn had understood from the beginning that airtight was what she needed, not dramatic. Yates was charged in late November. Moreland's name did not appear in the charging document, which Evelyn had expected. Yates was an employee who had allegedly acted, according to the filing, on his own initiative. Nobody in the county believed this, but what nobody believed and what a court could prove were different categories, and Evelyn was clear-eyed about the difference. What mattered was that Yates was charged, which meant the incident was documented and public, which meant Moreland's ability to operate in the gray was now constrained by the fact that everyone could see where the gray had led. The county knew what had happened. That was enough, for now. Marcus Holt came to the Reeves Ranch the week after the filing and asked to speak with Evelyn directly, which was a shift from every previous visit where he'd come for Colton and found her as an afterthought. She met him in the barn, where she was working, because she didn't have time to move to a more formal location and didn't particularly want to. Mr. Moreland is prepared to withdraw his interest in any water arrangement on your dead 40 property, Holt said. I was standing in the barn aisle with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a professional man doing a thing he'd been sent to do that he'd rather not be doing. I know, Evelyn said. She was checking a crossbred heifer's weight record against its mother's line. Holt blinked. The withdrawal is unconditional. I understood it would be. She made a note in her record book. Tell Mr. Moreland I appreciate the communication. Holt stood there for a moment with the uncertain quality of a man who'd arrived prepared for a negotiation and found the other party had already moved past the point where one was necessary. Is there anything else you'd want conveyed? She looked up from the record book. Tell him the disease protocol I distributed in September is available to any operation in the county that wants to use it, including his. The offer stands regardless of anything else. Holt looked at her for a moment. Why would you? Because sick cattle in a county create risk for everyone's cattle, she said. It's not generosity, it's practical. He left. She went back to her records. The crossbred animal's first full season of health data had produced numbers that she'd been looking at every morning for 3 weeks, with the particular satisfaction of watching a hypothesis become a fact. The disease resistance differential between the crossbred animals and the Maine Reeves herd during the September outbreak was not marginal. It was substantial enough that when she laid the two sets of records side by side, the story they told was plain enough for anyone to read, rancher or not. She took the comparison records to Colton on a Saturday. She spread them on the desk in the study the way she'd spread her first notebook there, months ago, when she'd told him about the sick animals that Dutch hadn't caught. The difference was that this time he leaned forward immediately and looked at what she'd put in front of him instead of waiting for her to leave. 3% versus 19% presentation rate, he said. In the same herd environment, same exposure period, same weather conditions. The variable is genetics and preseason water status. He was quiet, studying the numbers. She let him study them. Dutch was asking me yesterday, he said after a while, about expanding the crossbreeding program. He wants to bring in 2 more bulls next season. She had not expected this. Not the content. She'd been planning to propose exactly that, but the source. Dutch asked you. He's been watching the numbers himself. Colton looked up from the records. He's been watching for a while. She sat down in the chair across from him. 2 bulls would allow us to cover the main herd systematically over 2 seasons. By the 3rd season, the herd profile would be substantially different. What would you need? She told him. She'd already priced it, already identified the Texas rancher who could supply the specific genetic line she wanted, already calculated the feed and management adjustments the transition would require. She'd written most of it in her notebook over the previous month in the small, tight handwriting that had become, without her noticing, the handwriting of someone who expected eventually to be able to use what she wrote. Colton listened to the whole plan. Then he said, "Write it up formally. I want to take it to the bank in January for a supplemental credit line." She looked at him. "You want to take my breeding proposal to the bank?" "Our breeding proposal," he said. He said it in the same flat, correcting tone she sometimes used when precision mattered, and she recognized the echo of herself in it and felt something shift in the room between them that she didn't try to name. "All right," she said. "I'll have it written by the end of the month." The county's relationship to Evelyn Reeves changed that winter, in the way that things change when they've been in motion for a while and finally arrive somewhere visible. It wasn't a single event. It was accumulated. It was the ranchers who'd used her disease protocol coming to her in November to ask about winter management practices for animals that had been weakened by the outbreak. It was the conversation at the county agricultural meeting in December, a meeting she attended for the first time, because Colton had told her it was happening and asked if she wanted to come, which was the first time he'd asked, where 3 men had sought her out specifically, not to be courteous, but because they had genuine questions she could actually answer. It was Helen Barker, who had made the comment about hobbies at the social gathering in the summer, finding her at the post office in December and asking, with only a brief pause before doing so, where Evelyn had gotten her training in cattle genetics. "Correspondence and reading, mostly," Evelyn said, "and watching. Watching is underrated." Helen had nodded in the way of someone absorbing something they hadn't expected to need to absorb, and they'd had a 10-minute conversation about breed management that ended with Helen asking for the name of the Billings professor Evelyn had been corresponding with, and Evelyn gave it to her because she'd always believed information moved better when it moved freely. The invitation came in January. It came from the Montana Territorial Agricultural Association, which was a formal body of some significance, not enormous, but real, that convened twice a year and had never, in its 14-year history, invited a woman to present at its meetings. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell Reeves and asked whether she would be willing to speak at the spring convening on the subject of crossbreeding genetics and disease resistance management, referencing specifically the protocol she'd distributed during the September outbreak. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Then she read it again. Then she set it down and picked up her coffee and sat there for a moment with the ordinary morning sounds of the house around her. Clara at the stove, the wind outside doing what it did, and felt something she didn't often let herself feel, which was the uncomplicated satisfaction of having been right about something that had cost her enough that being wrong would have been serious. She showed it to Colton at breakfast. He read it once. "You'll go," he said. "I'm considering it." "Evelyn." He set the letter down. "You'll go." She looked at him across the table. "It's a significant platform." "I know what it is. People will have opinions about a woman speaking at... People had opinions about a woman buying the dead 40, he said. People had opinions about the disease protocol and the crossbreeding program and the sheriff filing. Their opinions have a poor track record. He picked up his fork. You'll go. She went. The spring convening of the Montana Territorial Agricultural Association was held in Billings in March, in a meeting hall that seated approximately 120 people and was full to the walls when she walked to the front of it. She had written her presentation in the same careful, plain language she used for everything. No performance, no flourish, just what she'd observed and measured and what it meant and why it mattered. She'd gone over it 3 times the night before in her hotel room, not rehearsing exactly, but making sure she knew where she was going at every point, so that when she stood in front of a room full of men who had never expected to receive information from someone like her, she would be moving forward rather than finding her way. She was not a natural orator. She knew this about herself. Her voice was clear but not large, and she didn't have the quality some speakers have of seeming to fill a room with their presence. What she had instead was specificity and data, and the kind of evident competence that doesn't need to perform itself. She showed the comparison records from the September outbreak on a large chart that a Billings printer had prepared from her measurements. She walked through the aquifer identification methodology that had led to the dead 40 wells. She explained the crossbreeding genetics protocol in plain terms that a rancher without technical training could follow, because she'd written it for ranchers, not for professors. She spoke for 40 minutes. The questions afterward went on for an hour and 15 minutes, which had apparently not happened before at an association convening. The man who asked the last question was a rancher from the eastern part of the territory she'd never met, a broad, weathered man in his 60s named Frederick Lund, who had land that had been in his family for 30 years and a cattle operation that was substantial enough that his questions had a specificity to them that matched hers. The aquifer identification work you described, he said. The drainage convergence methodology. Did you develop that yourself, or is there a published source? I developed it from several sources, she said. I can write up the methodology in detail if that would be useful. It would be extremely useful, Lund said. I've got 2 properties in my county that I've always thought might have water I haven't found yet. I'd like to know how to look. Send me your parcel descriptions and whatever topographic records you have, she said. I'll give you my read. Colton had come to Billings for the convening. He hadn't told her he was coming, and she'd found him standing at the back of the room when she'd looked up during the question period. And she'd registered his presence and kept talking, because there was nothing else to do, and because the work was the work regardless of who was watching. Afterward, in the hotel dining room, he ordered food for both of them, without asking what she wanted, which she'd normally have minded, and brought her tea without being asked because she'd been talking for 2 hours, and he'd noticed she was hoarse. She drank the tea and he ate, and they sat in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have been through enough together that silence doesn't require management. Lund, he said after a while. I know the Lund family. His operation is larger than ours. I know. He was serious about the aquifer methodology. I know. Colton turned his water glass in his hands. People are going to want to hire you. Some of them are going to want to hire me, she said. Some of them are going to want to take what I know and pay me as little as possible for it, which is different. He looked at her. I've been thinking, she said, about what form the next stage of this takes. The breeding program is running, the water situation is secured, the disease protocol is distributed. She set down the tea. What we don't have is a formal structure for the consulting work. If I'm going to be advising other operations, which is what Lund and at least 2 other men in that room today were asking about, then the terms of that advisory work should be structured so that the Reeves operation benefits from it, and I'm not donating my knowledge as a courtesy. Colton was quiet for a moment. You want to formalize it. I want it to be real work with real terms, not a rancher's wife giving useful advice at meetings. What would that look like? She'd thought about this. She told him, a consulting arrangement under the Reeves Ranch name, with fees set at rates that reflected the demonstrated value of the work, and she had the demonstrated value documented in the form of the health records and the water productivity numbers and the disease outcome comparisons, and structured so that the work remained connected to the ranch operation rather than separate from it. You've been planning this, he said. Since January, she said. Since the letter came. He looked at her with the expression that had been developing across 6 months into something she recognized as genuine rather than performed. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the attentiveness of a man who had stopped underestimating what was in front of him and was now simply watching it clearly. What do you need from me to set it up? Your agreement to the structure, and your name on the formal registration alongside mine, which carries more weight in the county. You have it. And she said, I need you to tell Dutch that I have authority over the breeding program without sign-off from the foreman on each decision. Dutch is good at his work, and I have no interest in going around him, but the current arrangement means every crossbreeding decision requires your approval, and that slows things down unnecessarily. Colton was quiet for a moment. Dutch may have feelings about that. Dutch has come around, she said. He's been asking me questions about the genetics for 2 months. He'll be fine. How do you know? Because he watched the September numbers the same way you did, and he drew the same conclusions. She met his eyes. Give me the authority, and I'll make sure Dutch has everything he needs to feel confident in the program. It doesn't have to be a confrontation. It just has to be clear. All right, he said. She nodded. She looked down at the table for a moment. There's one more thing, she said. He waited. The original contract, she said. Paragraph 14. Management decisions on jointly held land requiring Senior Reeves family approval. She kept her voice even. I want it amended. He was quiet for long enough that she felt the full weight of the silence. Paragraph 14 had been the first thing she'd objected to, the night she arrived, when she'd read the contract on his desk while he watched her with the impatience of a man who expected either compliance or retreat. She'd signed it anyway because she'd had no choice. She'd said she wanted it noted that she'd objected because she'd understood that the record would matter later. I'll have the attorney redraft it, he said. I want joint decision-making authority. Not advisory, not subject to review, joint. I understood what you meant. She looked at him. Evelyn. He set down the water glass. I'm not going to fight you on that. You've earned it several times over, and I've known it for a while, and I'm telling you now, plainly, that I know it. He said this in the same rough way he'd apologized about the water rights, without grace but without evasion, and she received it the same way, without inflation, without diminishment. Thank you, she said. The contract amendment took 3 weeks to complete because attorneys in territorial Montana did not move quickly, but it was complete by April, and it said what she'd asked it to say, and she signed it at the kitchen table with Clara as witness again. And Colton signed it across from her, and Margaret, who had taken to being present at the kitchen table during significant events with a consistency that nobody commented on, signed as the second witness. Spring came the way Montana spring comes, reluctantly, in fits, with cold snaps that made you think it had changed its mind. The crossbred animals from the Texas line had come through the winter in better condition than the main herd, as she'd projected, and she'd spent March doing the individual assessments that would form the baseline data for the next season's breeding decisions, going animal by animal with the methodical attention that Dutch now stood nearby and watched without pretending he wasn't learning something. One morning in late April, she was in the northeast pasture of the Dead 40 with her record book and the 2 youngest crossbred heifers when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to find Colton riding toward her across the new grass. He pulled up short of the fence and sat on his horse looking at the animals for a moment. Patterson's back, he said. Says he can drill 2 more wells on the southern portion if the assessment comes back the way you think it will. I think it will, she said. He wants to start in June. June is good. She made a note in her record book. The Lund parcel reports came. I saw them on the desk. His western property is interesting. There's a drainage pattern in the topographic records that's consistent with what I found here. I want to ride out and look at it before I give him a firm assessment. Colton was quiet for a moment. Lund invited us both, he said, to ride his property. The letter came yesterday. She looked up from the record book. Both of us. That's what the letter says. She stood in the new grass of the Dead 40, the land that had been a wound, that everyone had called worthless, that she'd bought with everything she had because she'd known how to look at it correctly. And she felt the width of what the last year had been, the long patience of it, the sustained work of it, the specific loneliness of being the only person in a room who knows what they know and hasn't yet been given the standing to say it. She felt all of that and let it be what it was, which was real and also the past. Tell him yes, she said. She went back to her records. The heifers moved around her in the morning light, easy and unhurried, in the particular way of well-fed animals on ground that had enough water underneath to hold them through whatever came. Frederick Lund's letter was sitting on the kitchen table when she came in that evening, and she read it through once, standing, still in her barn coat. At the bottom, in a postscript written in a different ink than the rest, added after, she guessed, after he'd written the invitation and decided to say one more thing, Lund had written, "What you presented in Billings was the most practical piece of ranching knowledge I've encountered in 30 years of this work. My foreman read your disease protocol 3 times. I mention this only so you know the value of what you're doing, in case no one around you is saying so clearly." She set the letter down. She stood in the kitchen while Clara moved around her and the house made its evening sounds, and the lamp threw its particular yellow light across the walls. She wasn't the woman who'd arrived with a contract sliding off a table onto the floor. She wasn't the woman who'd signed paragraph 14 standing at the edge of a desk while a man waited for her to comply or flinch. She was something that had been built out of all the years before that, and all the months since. Something that had been present from the beginning and had simply been waiting for the conditions that would let it grow. She picked up her notebook and went to the study to write up the Lund assessment before the day's observations got cold in her memory. And she worked until the lamp needed trimming and the house had gone quiet around her. And she was still working when Colton knocked on the open door at 9 o'clock with a cup of tea she hadn't asked for and set it on the corner of the desk without interrupting her and went back to whatever he'd been doing. She drank the tea. She kept working. Outside, the Montana night was doing what it always did, pressing down on the land with its full cold weight, indifferent and enormous. And the land was doing what it had always done, which was hold. The Lund property ride happened in early May, when the territorial roads were dry enough to travel without losing a horse to mud, and the days had lengthened enough that you could get real work done before the light gave out. Frederick Lund met them at his gate himself, which Evelyn noted as a courtesy that meant something from a man of his standing. He was the way she'd expected from his questions at the convening, direct, unhurried, with the particular quality of a rancher who had spent decades learning from the land and had enough security in what he knew to be genuinely curious about what he didn't. He shook Colton's hand and then turned to Evelyn and shook hers with the same grip and said, "Mrs. Reeves, I've been looking forward to this since Billings." And she could tell he meant it because men who don't mean things don't say them with that particular plainness. They rode the western property for 4 hours. She carried her notebook and her compass and the topographic records Lund had sent, and she asked him questions as they went, about where water pooled after rain, about which areas of the fence needed most repair from soil movement, about what the previous owner had told him when he'd bought the land 30 years back. Lund answered everything carefully and didn't ask why she needed to know until she explained the methodology, and then he listened to the explanation with the full attention of a man who understood that he was being taught something worth learning. She found what she'd expected to find. The drainage convergence on the western edge of the property was even more pronounced than the topographic records had suggested, because topographic records in the territory were of variable quality and ground truth was always better. She flagged 3 locations with stakes from her saddlebag and told Lund which to drill first and why, and what depth to expect water at, and what the likely yield range would be based on the indicators she'd identified. Lund stood at the 3rd stake and looked at the ground, and then looked at her. "My man has ridden this property for 22 years, he said. He never saw this." "He wasn't looking for it," she said. "Nobody looks for water in places that look dry. Except you." "I look for water in places that act like they're holding it," she said. "The surface is different from the behavior. You have to read the behavior." Lund was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have a colleague in Wyoming, name's Barnett. He's been having herd health problems for 3 seasons, and he's tried everything. His veterinarian has suggested, and nothing has shifted the pattern." He looked at her steadily. "I'd like to put you in contact with him, if you're willing, with the understanding that his operation is large enough that a consulting arrangement would be worth formalizing." She looked at Colton, who was sitting his horse a respectful distance away, and hadn't inserted himself into the conversation once in 4 hours, which she'd noticed and appreciated. "Have him write to me," she said. "I'll need his herd records for the past 3 seasons, his water source documentation, and his land management logs before I can tell him anything useful." "I'll tell him exactly that," Lund said. They ate dinner at the Lund house that evening, a real dinner, at a table with Lund's wife Agnes, who had the comfortable authority of a woman who'd built a household the same way Evelyn was building an operation, through sustained daily competence rather than declaration. Agnes asked Evelyn direct questions about the breeding program and listened to the answers without performing interest, because the interest was real. It was the first social dinner Evelyn had sat through in the territory where the conversation had been worth having, and she came back to the hotel room afterward and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about that, about how long it had taken to arrive somewhere where the room included her as a matter of course, rather than as an accommodation. Colton came in from checking on the horses and found her sitting there. "Agnes Lund asked me," he said, pulling off his boots, "how long you'd been working in cattle genetics." "What did you tell her?" "I told her since you were about 12, that you'd taught yourself from journals and correspondence because nobody around you had what you needed to learn." He set the boots by the door. She said that explained a great deal. What did she mean? He looked at her across the room. She meant that people who learn something because they had to learn it tend to know it differently than people who were taught it, more completely. He sat down in the chair by the window. "She's right." Evelyn looked at him. These moments, the ones where he said something accurate and uncomplicated without wrapping it in anything, were still surprising to her, not because they'd become rare, but because she hadn't yet fully adjusted to expecting them. "You've been quiet today," she said. "I've been listening," he said. "It's educational." She laughed. It came out before she'd decided to, the short, real kind of laugh. And he looked at her with something that was close to a smile, which on his face had a particular quality of being more significant than a full smile would have been on someone else's. "Barnett in Wyoming," she said after a moment. "If Lund's assessment is right about the scale of the operation, the consulting fee should be—" "Evelyn." He said her name in the tone he used when he wanted her to stop working for a moment. "It's 9 o'clock." She stopped. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. The Barnett correspondence began in June and produced, over the course of 4 months of letters, a consulting engagement that took Evelyn to Wyoming twice that summer. Once, to assess the herd and the water situation and the land management practices, and once to deliver the revised protocol she'd developed based on what she'd found, which was a combination of 3 problems that had been interacting with each other in ways that Barnett's veterinarian had been treating individually and therefore never fully resolving. The second Wyoming visit, in August, Colton came with her. Not because she needed him to, the work was hers and they both knew it, but because the Barnett operation was large enough and prominent enough in the territory that a husband not accompanying his wife on a significant professional engagement would have generated a kind of social friction that was more trouble than the trip. This was the explicit reason she'd suggested he come. The actual reason was more layered and she didn't fully examine it, because some things are better left operating than analyzed. The Barnett problem resolved over the following season in the way that complex, interconnected problems resolve when you address all 3 components, rather than rotating between them, gradually, then conclusively. Barnett wrote her a letter in October that was 4 pages long and covered, among other things, a 17% improvement in herd health metrics and the successful identification of 2 previously unknown water sources on his eastern property using the drainage convergence methodology she'd walked him through. In the last paragraph he mentioned, somewhat tentatively, that he'd spoken with 2 other ranchers in his county who were experiencing similar challenges and had given them her name, and he hoped that was acceptable. She wrote back that it was entirely acceptable and asked him to have them send their records. The consulting work grew the way the water had grown under the dead 40. Not explosively, not in ways that were immediately visible from the surface, but with the steady structural accumulation of things that are building on solid foundation. By the end of the 2nd year, it had become, without her having declared it a business or given it a formal name, something that functioned like one. There were 6 ongoing client operations in 3 territories. There were 2 former clients who had been so transformed by the protocols that they'd become informal advocates, referring other struggling ranchers the way satisfied patients refer doctors. There was a correspondence list that had grown to include her Billings professor, 2 Wyoming veterinarians, a territorial land assessor who had become fascinated by the aquifer identification methodology, and Frederick Lund, who wrote regularly with questions about his own expanding operation and sometimes with questions on behalf of neighbors he was trying to help. She formalized it in the spring of the 3rd year. The name was her idea, and she'd been certain about it from the moment it arrived in her mind. Hartwell Land and Cattle Consulting. Not Reeves. Not Hartwell Reeves. Hartwell, which was her family name and the name she'd carried into a marriage that nobody had expected to produce anything, and which had produced, among other things, this. She told Colton at breakfast. He looked up from his coffee. Hartwell, he said. It's my name, she said, and it's the name on the water rights registration and on the dead 40 deed. The consulting work grows from those assets. The name should reflect that. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him work through it, not the legal or business implications, which he understood, but the other thing, the weight of a name that wasn't his being put on the front of something that would carry significance in the territory. All right, he said, you're not going to argue. No. He picked up his coffee. Your grandmother's money bought the dead 40. Your methodology found the water. Your protocol is what people are paying for. He looked at her over the rim of the cup. It should be your name. She held that for a moment. Then she said, the ranch operation stays Reeves Ranch. The consulting business is Hartwell. They're different things that work together. I know the difference, he said. The registration was filed in April with a Billings attorney, a different attorney than the one she'd used for the water rights, a woman named Frances Delacroix, who had come to the territory from St. Louis 3 years prior and had built a practice substantial enough that she was selective about clients, and who had come to Evelyn's attention through a letter Lund's wife Agnes had sent mentioning that she'd found an attorney in Billings who didn't need things explained twice. Evelyn had written to her, and they'd had a single meeting that had lasted 3 hours and covered the consulting business structure, liability considerations, and the proper documentation of the intellectual property that the methodology represented. Frances Delacroix had a way of asking questions that was different from most attorneys. Evelyn had encountered, she asked them the way Evelyn asked questions about land, which was to understand the structure underneath, rather than to confirm what she already thought she knew. The drainage convergence methodology, Frances said. Is it documented anywhere formally, published, registered, anything that establishes you as the originating source? Evelyn had thought about this, but hadn't resolved it. It's documented in my notebooks. My Billings correspondent has correspondence from me describing the development of it over time. That's helpful, but not sufficient if someone else decides to publish it or claim development. Frances made a note. You should write it up formally. A technical paper, something that can be filed with a date stamp, not necessarily published, although publication would be stronger, but documented in a way that establishes priority. I'm not an academic. No, Frances said. But you developed an original methodology that other people are using and finding valuable. That's what academic papers document. The credential comes from the work, not the other way around. She wrote the paper over the course of 6 weeks, in the evenings, at the small desk in what had stopped being the spare room sometime in the second year and had become simply her room, a workspace more than a bedroom, with notebooks stacked on every horizontal surface and correspondence sorted into the system she'd developed, and the lamp burning late enough that Colton had twice, without comment, left oil by the door when the supply on her desk was running low. The paper was 42 pages. She sent it to her Billings correspondent, who sent it back with 17 pages of notes that were more enthusiastic than critical, and she incorporated what was useful and defended what she stood behind in a return letter that was itself 14 pages, and he wrote back and called it the most rigorous piece of applied land hydrology he'd seen produced by a non-academic practitioner, and she wrote back and said she wasn't sure non-academic was the right modifier, but she understood what he meant. The paper was filed with Frances Delacroix's office in September, with a date stamp that established priority on the methodology. 3 months later, her Billings correspondent submitted it to the Western Agricultural Journal on her behalf, and it was accepted for publication in the spring edition. She found out about the acceptance in a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning while she was in the barn, and Clara brought it out because the handwriting on the envelope was the professor's, and Clara had learned to recognize it. Evelyn read it standing in the barn aisle, with one hand still on the fence rail, and then folded it back into the envelope, and stood there for a moment with the barn sounds around her and the particular stillness of someone who has just received news that they've been working toward long enough that its arrival requires a moment of adjustment. Dutch came around the corner from the feed room and saw her standing there. Good news or bad, he said. Good, she said. Then why do you look like that? She looked at him. Dutch had changed over the 3 years she'd been at the Reeves Ranch in the way that people change when they've been paying attention. Not dramatically, not in ways he would have named or acknowledged, but in the particular direction of someone who has stopped assuming and started observing. He asked her questions freely now, without the previous framework of whether he was supposed to be asking her. He referred to the breeding program as the breeding program without qualifier. Last winter, when a neighboring rancher's son had come to look at the operation, Dutch had walked him through the crossbreeding genetics using the same language Evelyn used, without either of them remarking on where he'd learned it. "It's just a lot of work that arrives somewhere," she said. Dutch nodded once, in the way of a man who understood that sentence without needing it expanded. "The 2 new heifers from the spring cross are looking strong," he said, because he was Dutch, and the work was always the available topic when the other topics were too large. "I know," she said. "I checked them this morning." "Of course you did," he said, and went back to the feed room. The publication of the paper in the Western Agricultural Journal created a different kind of attention than anything that had come before, because it moved through a different network. Not the county ranching community, not the territorial agricultural associations, but the larger world of people who read journals and track developments in land and livestock management across the West. She received letters from people she'd never heard of in places she'd never been, from Nevada and Oregon and Colorado. And once, memorably, from a man in Argentina who had read the paper in a translated summary and wanted to know if she could advise on similar aquifer identification work in the Pampas. She wrote back to the Argentine with a letter explaining what she knew and what she didn't about his specific geography, which was honest and probably not entirely useful, but she sent it because she didn't believe in not responding to people who had taken the trouble to write seriously. The attention brought money, which was real and useful, and which she tracked with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. By the end of the 4th year, Hartwell Land and Cattle Consulting had operating revenue that exceeded the consulting fees she'd been charging in the first year by a factor that she and Frances Delacroix discussed in their quarterly meetings with the practical language of 2 women who had both spent time in contexts where their work was undervalued and had independently concluded that the corrective was precision rather than complaint. The Reeves Ranch operation had also changed. The crossbreeding program had progressed far enough that Dutch's herd assessments were producing numbers that no longer required comparison to make a point. They were simply good numbers, season after season, with the specific consistency that comes from breeding decisions made on data rather than tradition. The Dead 40 had 4 wells now in a pasture that had recovered enough to be genuinely productive, and the land that Evelyn had bought for a sum that made the county laugh had been assessed by the county assessor the previous spring at a value that was, without drama, remarkable. Colton had handled the assessment report in the way he handled most things, now that required him to acknowledge the degree to which everything had changed, by reading it carefully, making a comment that was accurate and understated, and returning to work. The comment, in this case, had been, "Patterson's going to want a raise." She'd said, "Patterson already asked. I said yes." And Colton had said, "Of course you did," in the same tone Dutch had used in the barn, and she'd felt the particular warmth of being known in the way that only people who have watched you work for years can know you. The 5th year brought the thing she hadn't planned for, which was always the thing that mattered most. It came in the form of an invitation from the territorial governor's office, a formal letter, embossed, addressed to Evelyn Hartwell Reeves, requesting her participation in a newly formed advisory council on land and water management for the territory. The council was to include representatives from agricultural, legal, and commercial sectors, and her name had been put forward, the letter explained, by 3 separate sources, one of which was Frederick Lund, whose name now carried enough weight in the territory that his endorsement was described in the letter as particularly significant. She read the letter at the kitchen table. Margaret was across from her with her morning tea, which was their regular arrangement now, the 2 of them at the table in the early morning before the household fully woke, in a companionship that had developed without either of them deciding to develop it, built out of 5 years of shared mornings and the gradual discovery that they were more similar than either had initially expected. Margaret read the letter when Evelyn set it down. She read it the whole way through without speaking. Then she put it back on the table and picked up her tea. "Your mother-in-law would like you to know," Margaret said, "that she told Colton he was wrong about you before the first month was out." Evelyn looked at her. "He didn't believe me," Margaret said. "He was very certain he was right, which was something he'd inherited from his father and which I had tried with limited success to correct for 30 years. She drank her tea. I mention it only so you know it was said. What did you see? Evelyn said. In the first month. Margaret considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The way you picked up the contract from the floor, she said. You didn't hesitate and you didn't make a production of it. You just picked it up and read it. She set her cup down. A woman who picks up something that's been thrown at her and reads it carefully, that's not a woman who's going to be a burden. That's a woman who's going to be a problem for anyone who underestimates her. You didn't say anything to me. You didn't need me to, Margaret said. You needed room to work. Saying things would have cluttered it. They sat in the comfortable morning quiet for a moment. I'm going to accept the governor's council appointment, Evelyn said. I know you are, Margaret said. It will take time away from the consulting work. The consulting work will survive a council appointment, Margaret said. It's built solidly enough. Evelyn looked at her. When did you start following the consulting business? When Francis Delacroix started attending the same church as Agnes Lund, and Agnes started writing me letters. Margaret's expression had the quality it got when she was being deliberately opaque about how much she knew. I have a correspondence network that you're not fully aware of. I'm beginning to understand that, Evelyn said. She accepted the governor's council appointment by letter that afternoon, with a response that Francis Delacroix reviewed for tone and legal implication before it was sent, and she began the work of organizing what that participation would require. The reading, the preparation, the understanding of the territorial water law that she needed to develop beyond what she'd absorbed, incidentally, from the sheriff filing and the Dead 40 registration. She ordered 3 books from a Billings legal supplier and worked through them in the evenings, in the way she'd always worked through things she needed to know, which was systematically and without pretending she knew more than she did. Colton found her one evening with the water law book spread across the desk alongside a territorial survey map she'd cross-referenced with 3 other documents. Council work? He said. Preparation, she said. I need to understand the water adjudication framework before the first meeting. There are existing claims in the territory that interact with the aquifer work I've been doing, and I need to know where the legal boundaries are before I start advising. He looked at the map for a moment. There's a water claim dispute on the eastern end of the territory that's been tied up in territorial court for 6 years, he said. Lund mentioned it. 2 ranching families and a mining interest all claiming rights to the same drainage basin. I've read the court filings, she said. Francis got me access. The problem is that neither party's claim is documented well enough to be conclusive, and the court keeps deferring because nobody can establish priority with the evidence that's been submitted. Could your methodology establish it? She looked at the map. If someone applied the drainage convergence analysis to the historical record, yes. You could probably reconstruct which use predated the others by examining the secondary aquifer indicators and cross-referencing with the land entry records. She paused. It would take significant time. Is it worth doing? It would establish a precedent for how the methodology gets applied in legal context, she said, which would matter for every water dispute in the territory after this one. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, it's worth doing. He nodded. He stood at the edge of her desk for a moment in the way he did sometimes, not reading anything, just present, which was its own kind of communication, and which she'd come to understand as his version of the things other people said with words. The first council meeting is in October, she said. I know. I put it on the ledger calendar. She looked up at him. You put my council meeting on the ranch ledger calendar. It's an important date, he said, in the tone of someone stating the obvious, and went to get a coffee. And she sat there for a moment with the water law books and the territorial map and the awareness, warm and uncomplicated, that the man who had thrown a contract across the table at her and said, not because anyone wanted you, was now tracking her council meetings in the ranch ledger alongside calving schedules and water assessments, because it had become, without ceremony, part of the life they were running together. The Eastern Water Dispute Analysis took her 4 months and produced a document that was, by her own assessment, the most technically rigorous thing she'd written. It combined the drainage convergence methodology with a historical reading of the territorial land entry records and a physical assessment of the disputed basin that she conducted herself in September. Writing the land with Francis Delacroix, alongside her taking legal notes and asking clarifying questions with the same quality of precision that made her the right attorney for complicated things. She submitted the analysis to the territorial court in November, through Francis, as an expert assessment document. The case was resolved in January, not in the dramatic fashion of a trial verdict, but in the way that cases resolve when one piece of evidence so substantially clarifies the factual record that the parties' attorneys begin suggesting settlement. The mining interest withdrew its priority claim. The two ranching families reached an agreement on shared use that was equitable enough for both sides to accept without losing face. The territorial judge wrote a comment in his settlement approval that mentioned the quality of the hydrological analysis submitted and the value of methodologically rigorous evidence in resolving long-standing resource disputes. He didn't name her in the comment. She didn't require him to. Francis kept a copy of the document and filed it alongside the consulting business registration and the journal publication and the water rights deed and the amended marriage contract, which were the documents that constituted, in Francis's professional assessment, an unusually well-documented professional record for anyone, let alone someone who had arrived in the territory as an unwanted bride 5 years prior with nothing but a notebook and a grandmother's bank draft. The spring of the 6th year arrived with the particular quality of Montana springs that follow hard winters, everything coming back at once, insistent, as if the land had been planning it the whole cold season and was now executing without hesitation. The crossbred herd was at full production. The dead 40 was unrecognizable from the wound it had been. The consulting business had, at Francis's suggestion, taken on a junior correspondent in Wyoming, a young woman named Ruth, who had written Evelyn an unsolicited letter describing her own observations about water patterns on her family's failing ranch, using the kind of specific, data-oriented language that Evelyn recognized because it was the same language she'd been using since she was 12 years old, watching the world that adults couldn't quite see. She'd hired Ruth immediately and paid her properly, because she'd made a decision when the business reached the scale where hiring was possible that she would pay people what their work was worth, rather than what the market suggested was the acceptable minimum. And the people she'd hired had all, without exception, worked with the kind of engaged investment that comes from being treated as worth investing in. It was Dutch who named the thing that nobody had named yet, on a morning in June when she was doing the seasonal herd assessment, and he was walking beside her through the northeast pasture with his own record book, which he now kept in the same systematic way she'd taught him, without either of them naming the teaching. "People are calling this the Hartwell operation," he said, "when they talk about it in town." She looked up from the record she was making. "The Reeves Ranch. They say that too. But when they're talking about what it's become, what it represents..." He stopped. "They say the Hartwell operation." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that a problem?" he said. "No," she said. And then, because it was Dutch, and Dutch didn't need things dressed up, "It's just strange to hear still." "You built it," he said. "It makes sense that it carries your name." She went back to the record she was making. The heifer in front of her was the granddaughter of one of the original Texas crossbreds, 3rd generation, and the measurements she was recording confirmed what she'd been tracking across the whole breeding line. The drought resistance was holding, deepening even, becoming more reliably expressed with each successive generation. It was the thing she'd set out to build, years ago, and it was built, and the animals standing in front of her in the morning light were the proof of it, unhurried and strong and entirely indifferent to what they represented. Colton found her there at noon and said Lund had wired about a property in Nevada, another large operation, serious money, a ranching family that had been watching the Wyoming results and wanted to discuss a consulting engagement. He said it in the same tone he used to tell her about weather forecasts or feed deliveries, because that was the tone their life had settled into, one where her consulting work and the ranch work were both simply the work, equal in importance, managed together, without anyone's permission having to be sought. She said she'd write to the Nevada family that afternoon and find out what they actually needed before she agreed to anything, because she'd learned early that agreeing to consult before understanding the situation was how you ended up solving the wrong problem. He said that sounded right and went back to what he'd been doing. She stayed in the pasture for another hour, finishing the assessments, writing in the notebook that was the latest in a line of notebooks that stretched back to the small spare room of her first month at the Reeves Ranch, when she'd lain on the bed in the dark and thought about paragraph 14 and what she already knew that nobody had thought to ask her about. She thought sometimes about that woman, not often, not with sentimentality, but with the particular clear-eyed regard that you direct at your past self when enough time has passed to see her accurately. The woman who had signed the contract from the floor, who had ridden out to check the sick cattle without permission and come back with information that saved 3 animals, who had bought the dead 40 with everything she had because she knew how to read what the land was holding underneath what it showed on the surface. That woman hadn't been confident exactly. She'd been clear. There's a difference, and it matters, and Evelyn had learned that the difference is this. Confidence is about yourself, what you believe you can do. Clarity is about the thing in front of you, what it actually is. You can lose confidence. It wavers, gets knocked down, requires maintenance. Clarity is harder to knock out of a person who has built it from genuine observation rather than from what they've been told to believe. She'd always had clarity. Even in the hardest months, when Colton's contempt had been total, and the community's amusement had been comfortable, and she'd been the woman nobody wanted in a house she'd come to as a document, even then, she'd been clear. About what the land held, about what the cattle needed, about what she knew and what she'd have to learn, and how long she was willing to work before the work showed what it was. That was what she'd carry forward from all of it, she thought. Not the consulting revenue, or the journal publication, or the governor's council, or the county's altered assessment of who she was. Those were results. What she'd carry was the understanding that the space between what you actually know and what other people believe you know is not an obstacle. It's a workspace. And if you're willing to work in it, patiently, methodically, without waiting for permission to be right, it closes. She closed her notebook. She stood in the northeast pasture of the dead 40, on land that had been a wound and was now something else entirely. And she looked at the herd that was the product of years of decisions made carefully under conditions that hadn't been kind. And she let herself feel the full, uncomplicated weight of what had been built here. Not triumph. She'd never been particularly interested in triumph, more like the feeling that comes at the end of a long piece of work when you can see that it is what you meant it to be. Not perfect, because nothing built by human hands across human years is perfect, but real. Solid. Built on what was actually under there, rather than what the surface suggested. She walked back to the main house. Clara had lunch ready, and Margaret was at the table with a letter from Agnes Lund, and Colton came in from the south barn a few minutes after she did, with mud on his boots and a question about the Nevada family that she answered while she washed her hands at the basin, and they sat down together at the table and ate and talked about the things that needed doing in the next week. And the meal was ordinary, and the conversation was practical, and nothing about it would have looked significant to someone looking in from outside. But she thought, as she passed the bread and answered the Nevada question, and made a note in the margin of the record book she'd brought to the table, because she always brought the record book, that this was what it actually looked like. Not the moment of recognition at the convening, not the sheriff's filing, not the amended contract or the journal publication or the governor's letter. This, the ordinary Tuesday of a life that had been built from the ground up by someone who had been handed almost nothing and had found, underneath what she was given, something worth building on. It is a particular kind of courage, and it is not the kind that gets talked about most. The kind that gets talked about is the dramatic kind. The storm, the rescue, the confrontation with the powerful man. Those are real. They happened. But the courage that made all of it possible was quieter and harder to name. The kind that gets exercised at 2 a.m. with a record book and a lamp that needs trimming. The kind that picks up what's been thrown on the floor and reads it carefully. The kind that buys dead land because it knows how to look at what's underneath. The kind that works without waiting to be wanted. That kind of courage doesn't announce itself. It just continues, season after season, building what it builds, until one morning you look up from the work and find that the world has rearranged itself around what you've made. Not because the world changed its mind about you, but because you never changed your mind about the work. Evelyn Hartwell. Reeves passed the bread and made her note and ate her lunch, and the land outside held its water under its surface the way it always had. And the cattle moved across the pasture with the particular ease of animals that had been bred well for the ground they lived on, and the house settled around the people in it with the weight of a thing that was being used for what it was built for, which was, in the end, enough, more than enough. It was everything.